have with us Rob Maher today from engineering, and Rob's primary areas of interest are teaching and research in digital audio signal processing and audio engineering and acoustics. So he holds a BS degree in electrical engineering from Washington University in St. Louis, a master's from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and a PhD from University of Illinois, Urbana. So he has taught electrical engineering at the University of Nebraska and the University of Colorado, and a significant amount of time working in industry, acoustic industry. So has a lot of a long history and background in this particular field. Came to MSU in 2002, and he was department head in electrical engineering department from 2007 to 2017. So I assume that means you're stepping down.
Free.
You're still okay. And last but not least, Rob is a heck of a good runner. And he's one of these guys that you always see disappearing into the distance even when you're in the same race, both trails and on the road. So anyway, Rob's going to tell us about Soundscape Ecology. Looking forward to it.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Bruce. And being at a place like Montana State, there's a lot of people who are interested in outdoor activities and running and hiking and all that sort of thing. And so it's one of the fun things about working here, of course. So I've got a few remarks to make about this topic. I know ordinarily for the Institute on Ecosystems, you will be hearing from people from the west side of campus, but occasionally those of us on the east side over here can participate, and I'm really excited to do that. So the things I'm going to be talking about today have to do with soundscapes, and I've got a long outline here that we'll kind of refer back to, but I want to kind of define this term soundscapes, what that means, why it's important, and what relevance that might have to ecosystem studies. I'll talk a little bit about some of the research questions that are prominent right now in this field, and also share a few conclusions or things I think are interesting research areas. Generally speaking, this sort of work is done collaboratively with other types of scientists doing other sorts of work. As we'll see, many times bioacoustics is important, which is the study of animal vocalizations. And understanding animal behavior and so forth is not an expertise I have particularly, but it's something I'm quite interested in learning more about. So I'm hopeful that there will be opportunities to do some collaboration. So please let me know if that's something of interest to you. So maybe the first thing that's both obvious and not obvious is, what is sound? Most of us are very accustomed to dealing with sound, and from the time that we're infants to now, generally it sort of becomes automatic and you aren't consciously aware of your hearing sense. There are many animals that rely on acoustics primarily for their survival, and you can think of animals that are hunters based on what they hear, or avoiding being hunted by what they hear. And then there are animals that use sound for navigation. Bats are a good example, where they're using a sonar acoustic technique to detect their prey that they capture and also to avoid running into objects. But the sound itself in air that we're most familiar with is a vibration. So the air particles all around us, the atmosphere, is held against the earth by gravity. And down here at the depths of the atmosphere, close to the surface, there's a very high ambient air pressure due to that gravity holding the atmosphere here. What we're talking about with sound is a fluctuation, a very small change in that pressure that's sort of riding on top of the DC, the direct current that engineers talk about, the constant pressure. Most of the time we aren't so aware of the constant pressure, although we hear meteorologists talk about that. You know, it's a high pressure day or a low pressure day or something like that. But our hearing system is designed so that that constant pressure is equalized. So we have the eustachian tubes that go from the back of our throat up to the middle ear, and they allow the pressure to equalize on both sides of the eardrum. So our eardrum is sensing that very small fluctuation in pressure that we hear as sound. Sound is also a wave phenomenon, and like all waves, that means that it progresses from one place to another. We can determine how fast it does that, and we can determine a variety of directional pieces of information by studying that. And then sound being a wave, it has a wavelength and a variety of other things that can be very useful. So the speed of sound, how fast these waves travel through the air at room temperature is about 343 meters per second. So if you can visualize about 1,000 feet, so if you count 1,001, sound has traveled about 1,000 feet in that time, which seems pretty fast. The speed of light, on the other hand, is 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second. So there's a factor of 10 to the 6th, or a million, between the speed of light and the speed of sound. So we're all kind of familiar with that. Seeing a flash of lightning and then start counting, you know, there's sort of a law about that. You have to count the number of seconds between the flash of lightning and the sound, and that corresponds to about 5 seconds per mile. So if you can count 5 seconds, that means the lightning was 5 miles away, because the sound from, excuse me, if it's 5 seconds, it's a mile away. The sound takes 5 seconds to travel a mile. And we assume that the speed of light, being 1,000,000 times faster, is virtually instantaneous, and so we don't judge that. So if you've ever had the situation where you see the flash of lightning and you hear the thunder almost instantaneously on top of it, then you know that's very close, and hopefully you were hearing it inside, lying in bed or something, not out on a mountaintop. The speed of sound in helium, on the other hand, is about 3 times faster than in air. And if you've been to a party as a youngster or an oldster where you inhaled helium and then talked, you can hear the effects of that speed of sound change. The resonances of the vocal tracts are all shifted because of the wavelength being different, and that causes that effect. The other thing, underwater, if we're doing measurements of sound underwater, which is relevant if you're studying fisheries or marine mammals and so forth, the speed of sound there is about a little over 4 times faster than in air. So the characteristics are quite a bit different.
That's air at sea level?
Yes. So the speed of sound doesn't vary a whole lot with pressure. It does somewhat, but it varies pretty strongly with temperature. And so one of the effects that we do have to be aware of in the air, if you're making soundscape recordings, or if you're a submariner underwater and there are different layers of different temperature water, you can use that to your advantage to hide or to detect an adversary. And in the air, what this causes is refraction. So just like a lens that has a different permittivity than free space causes light waves to bend, sound waves actually bend in the atmosphere if we've got different temperatures of air. So if the air is cold near the ground and warmer as you go up, which is common on a winter night, the sound tends to bend down toward the earth. And so you have this impression that you can hear every little twig and pop and click and things on cold nights. On a hot day, when the sun is shining and the surface is very warm and you get colder as you go up in the atmosphere, the opposite thing happens. Sound waves propagating tend to bend upward, and so you tend to not hear things as well. You can see a train or cars in the distance, but you just don't hear them very well because of that refraction effect. So there are some interesting things there. One of the things you notice in town is that depending on the temperature gradients, people will complain about the noise from the football stadium speakers in the neighborhoods out beyond there if the temperature is right. If the temperature is warmer near the ground, the sound bends up and nobody complains. But as the sun starts going down and the temperature changes, the complaints start coming in. So it's an interesting phenomenon. Okay, so that's the background. So then what is a soundscape? What are we talking about when we refer to soundscape? And it's a very important ecosystem or system kind of concept. If you travel someplace or go to a park or you look out the window, you're familiar with a landscape. It's what your visual scene is, all the different objects at different distances and heights and colors and so forth. Soundscape is the oral, the audio equivalent of that. So if you are in a position where you can close your eyes and just listen, the soundscape is all of those things you hear around you. Our hearing is actually reasonably good in 3 dimensions. So we're able to detect sounds from different directions, even behind us or above us. And we learn how to do that pretty effectively as we go. In fact, for most people, I think the reason that we have ears is to know where to point our eyes. So they are the detector that works in all directions. We hear something, and then we vector over and point our eyes in the direction where that sound came from. So that's principally what many people will use their ears for. So a soundscape, one of the ways that we can define that is in terms of what are those components. And one of the popular ways to define a soundscape is to think in terms of three elements. The biophony is the portion of the soundscape that we attribute to animal or biological sounds. So bird calls, wolves howling, insects, amphibians, animals that are using acoustics for their lifestyle. We have the geophony, which is the sounds of nature that are due to wind blowing through the trees, waterfalls, avalanches, things like that that are kind of in the geological world that cause sound, and cracks occurring in ice, that kind of thing. And then we have the anthrophony, or anthropogenic sound, which is sounds caused by humans. And depending on the circumstances, we may or may not desire to have that human-caused sound in our soundscape, and in other cases, we may want to have that kind of thing there. So there are actually a lot of things that are done both objectively and subjectively when we deal with soundscapes. One of the things that's the most difficult for many people is this idea of how do you listen actively to sounds around you. There was a time when people had what was called a hi-fi at home, and they had a comfortable Eames chair that they would put in front of the loudspeakers of their hi-fi, and they would put on a record and then just sit there and listen to it. Okay? And nobody does that anymore that I'm aware of.
Oh yeah, Rufus.
Rufus Cohn, yes, Professor Cohn actually does do that. Maybe there are a few others. But for most people, sound has become this thing that you carry around with you in your mobile device, and you have earphones in, and just sort of background sound. So the idea of listening deliberately is a little less common than perhaps it once was. But if you listen to a soundscape, and we'll listen to a few of those here in a minute, you have to consciously think, what am I hearing? What do my ears and brain detect? And human beings are surprisingly good at decomposing very complicated sound fields into their individual component parts. In fact, they're so good, it's very challenging to try to make an automatic system that's able to do anywhere near as well as a human being can. The problem from an engineering standpoint is it's not introspectable. And what I mean by that is if I ask you, how did you detect that it was your mom's voice in that recording and not your aunt or your daughter or something like that, you just know it was that person. You can't really say exactly what subtle sonic attributes caused that. And if we're trying to write a computer program or something, we sort of need to be able to write down the rules of how we're going to do that. So it's, again, been a very challenging thing to get that working. The other thing that's kind of an issue here is that the temporal, ephemeral, and ethereal aspects of sound are very important. It goes by, and it's not easy to rewind. It just happens, and it's in real time, and you have to sort of remember what you just heard, and if you get distracted for a moment, it's gone. There's no way to do that. Now, for us people that do recording, then of course we have the opportunity to go back and listen over and over and so forth, but in most cases, you just have to keep that concentration going, and it can be a challenge. So there are people who study soundscapes in what architects refer to as the built environment. So these are soundscapes in a city or a public park, a university campus, other places like that. And believe it or not, there are landscape architects who specialize in acoustics. And they will design not only visually what a landscape looks like, but trying to make it acoustically pleasing. So if you're in a noisy city, you're going to be walking like I was on 34th Street in New York here. So just walking along the street, that's the sound that was picked up. Did you hear any birds in there? Frogs, amphibians, stuff like that? Not so much. You hear a lot of voices. There's just a high level of background noise, which causes people to have to speak a little louder than they otherwise would, which causes everybody else also have to speak a little louder than they otherwise would, and you just get this cacophony building up. And so people who day in and day out live in that environment have a certain higher blood pressure and other effects due to that. And so people who are concerned about that will design other parts of the city that have a different acoustical characteristic. Maybe they're using vegetation or things like that to cause a change in the effect. Here's an indoor environment soundscape. This was at a diner in New York City. Oh, did I play the same thing again? Sorry. That sounded familiar. Let's see if I get the other one here. Where's my mouse? There we go. Trying for this other, well, anyway, you can have a variety of different sounds that come out of these types of things, and people will study that as a different kind of urban ecology that might be different than what I'll be talking about now, which is more natural or environmental ecosystem soundscapes that we might think of. So this term natural soundscape is what comes up when you speak with naturalists or people from the National Park Service or rangers or others who are interested in conserving the natural environment around us. The natural soundscape, generally, we are going to presume that there's minimal anthropogenic sound. So the sounds of humans are not a principal aspect of that soundscape. You'll also see this referred to as natural quiet. And in many cases, it's anything but quiet, but it's referred to as natural quiet because it tends to be these sounds of nature in the geophony that we will hear. Now, most animals have evolved in circumstances where they are used to that natural quiet or natural soundscape environment. And many animals who use sound use that to identify their territory. They use that as a warning or to attract mates. They will use it to identify threats that are coming nearby and alert their companions about that. They'll also use it to detect their prey. And if you have ever seen a fox in the winter going along on the surface of the snow, listening intently for the sound of a little vole or mouse that's several feet deep in the snow walking along the surface, they can be very good at jumping up then and diving down into the snow and capturing that animal. Now you can imagine they are counting on the fact that they're able to hear that sound. And so if the background noise environment is different than the natural soundscape that they've evolved in, that may make it more difficult for that animal to locate that prey, and their success and survival may be affected by that. So it's an aspect of changes that are important in the environment. Similarly, there are robins that you may see hopping around on the ground that are listening and identifying where worms are in the ground based on their little sucking sound that they make, apparently, and are able to grab the worm out of the ground using that technique. And it's quite remarkable how some of these things work. And certainly the ability of animals to attract their mates is going to be affected by the soundscape. So if an animal is, let's say a frog is croaking in the spring and trying to attract its mate, that can also attract predators who have learned that that sound is associated with a species they might want to eat. But it also is something that if there's a lot of background noise, it may affect the radius over which that call is going to be successful. So there's several ecosystem aspects to that. The other interesting evolutionary phenomenon is known as the niche hypothesis. And this, I don't think, has been proven in all ecosystems, but the idea is that, well, in human use of the electromagnetic spectrum, we have the FCC, and we decide who gets to use which range of frequencies on the FM band for different stations, and it's very carefully done so they don't collide with each other. If you look at an analysis of the sounds of different birds and insects and amphibians and so forth in a sonic environment, in a soundscape, they also seem to have evolved that way, where they don't have their calls all on top of each other. Some are lower, some are higher, and they're utilizing the available sound spectrum in such a way that they can all communicate concurrently without those collisions that would otherwise occur. And so it's an interesting idea and something that, again, could be affected if there are changes in the background sonic environment, that some of the animals that may have evolved to use a particular band in the spectrum may not have as much success if it's being caused to have some kind of overlap with other sounds. Okay, so what do we use in an engineering standpoint? How do we measure these things? How do we represent them? sound is very difficult to picture, you know, literally and figuratively, because it sort of has this temporal aspect. We've got to somehow sort out what's going on. So this is an example of what an acoustician might look at for a sound measurement. So on the horizontal axis of this graph, we've got elapsed hours. So each tick here is a day, 24-hour period. And the curves here, the top one is showing the maximum sound pressure level, or kind of the loudness that occurred during that hour, during that part of the day. The blue curve in the middle here, that's the average, and then the black is the minimum. So the sound is fluctuating typically, and depending on the environment, you can have different ranges of these sounds. This was 2009 in July, and I'll talk about how we did this measurement in just a moment. But you notice here, about 4 days into July, there's this really high level that occurred out there. Any guess what might have happened there? Okay, so this was near a community, and there was a 4th of July, you know, fireworks exhibition and stuff like that. And so the measurements obviously picked up that anthropogenic sound that occurred at that time. And then there are other days where, for a variety of reasons, the sound level stayed very low, you know, relatively speaking. So we can study the diurnal and the monthly and weekly and annual variation in these sound levels and understand a little bit more about how that might affect that particular ecosystem. Now, the way I generally try to display or give information about audio signals is what's called a spectrogram. And a spectrogram is a fancy graph that has time on the horizontal axis, and the vertical axis is frequency, frequency in hertz. And then the graph itself is showing in color how intense the energy is at a particular time at a particular frequency. So the coordinates in the graph refer to time and frequency, and then the intensity of the color is how loud was it at that time and frequency. So here's an example. This is a spectrogram, and you probably can't read the scale on the bottom, but it's over a period of 1, 2, 3, 4, about 20 minutes. So from left to right, this is about 20 minutes of sound. And then vertically, it's showing the frequency scale. And you see a couple of these areas that have bright colors in them, and that means there was something loud there. Can anybody, just by looking at the spectrogram, identify what those sounds might be? Not real intuitive. After you've done this for a while, you can start noticing things. Like, for instance, on the left there, that this portion of the curve, do you see anything particular about the shape that you're seeing there? Is it slanted downward?
Yeah.
So the frequency, the loud frequency, is getting lower as time goes on. Let's listen to what that sound is and see if you can recognize it. Okay, propeller aircraft flying over, and the pitch is dropping. Why is the pitch dropping? It's known as the Doppler effect, that if the vehicle is moving at a significant fraction of the speed of sound, in front of that, we get this compression. The sound source has moved a little bit before the next cycle, and so we end up with shorter wavelengths than we would have otherwise. And so you end up with this as the moving thing goes by. Our brain has become very good at picking those kind of things up, and you just sort of don't even really think about the physics behind it, but that's quite effective. The other sound over here that has this sort of repeated kind of Morse code pattern, let's listen to that. So train, obviously, the train horn. And then there's a, oops. This is this loud, broad portion here. So the train actually kind of stopped on the track, and you're just hearing the locomotive making its sound. And then here's some natural quiet over in this part. Oops. Why isn't it letting me do what I want to do? Bill Gates, come to my rescue. Well, we'll listen to another one.
It's really quiet.
Yeah, it's really quiet. So in this spectrogram, we have these high frequency portions occupying a certain niche up here. That's those bird calls, making their little trills and so forth. And if you're a knowledgeable birder, you probably recognize what species of bird that was. I guess it was a red-winged blackbird or something. And so there's that. This low frequency portion down here at this time was the train or a vehicle. You can see the horn of the train here again. Those horizontal lines are the harmonics of that. And there was some thunder. Did you hear the thunder? Maybe that was what we heard down here. Later on, the rain starts falling, and there's a bunch of little pitter-patter of raindrops and things like that in here. And so there's a lot of information. The problem is that's just 2 minutes and 10 seconds. And if you wanted to do a whole hour, it takes a whole hour to listen to it. So it's practically speaking, one of the difficulties that we have in this type of work is that it's just very time consuming. So one of the research things that we've done is to try to say, is there a way that we could take this long, in this case 2-minute recording, and find the portions of that were meaningful in some sense to allow a person to essentially do a time lapse of this sound the way you can do a time lapse of a video scene where you have a higher frame rate and things happen really quickly. If we try to do that with sound recordings, it gets all munchkin and blah, 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 and it's not really useful to do. So here's a technique that we've been developing to try to identify interesting features in this and then create a composite recording that captures that 2 minutes in a shorter period of time. So here's what the compressed version looks like, or listens to. Okay, so in 18 seconds, we heard the bird, we heard the train a little bit, there was a couple pitter-patters of rain, and we heard some thunder. Okay, so for a public presentation or a kiosk at a park or something like that, often having something like this might be more useful than expecting someone to stand there and listen to 20 minutes of sound. It's hard for anybody to do that. Many of the studies the Park Service has done to try to understand soundscapes, they hire undergraduates to come into a room and put on headphones and listen to these naturally quiet scenes and then write down when they hear different things. And as you can imagine, it's like going out into a quiet area and sitting down in the middle of a field, and it's very soporific. So these people fall asleep almost instantly. So it's hard to make that work. All right, so here at MSU, over in the library, we actually have an interesting collection of different kinds of sounds. It's called the Acoustic Atlas. I don't have the URL here, but if you just type Acoustic Atlas into a search engine, you'll get there. And what they've done is collected lots of recordings, many of them from the Rocky Mountain region, of different kinds of animals, different soundscapes. There's a bunch of sounds in Yellowstone that are quite interesting. And I invite you to do that. The problem for me is that I start listening to these sounds, and then suddenly I notice it, like 4 hours have gone by and I haven't done anything. And so be careful. It's kind of addictive if you like this sort of thing. And so many things in the Acoustic Atlas to me are a little bit like going to a natural history museum where they have the butterflies with pins in a box. You can kind of sample these interesting things, but you aren't really getting an ecosystem view. And so my work generally isn't directly related to this because I have a more of a system view of things rather than these individual sound sources being the primary aspect. But I invite you to take a listen to it. It's really, really fun to do. So turning a little bit toward this natural quiet aspect of this, one of the areas that often comes up when we deal with soundscapes in a regulatory fashion has to do with the National Park Service. The National Park Service has this complicated statement in the Organic Act of the Park Service, which says that they are to conserve this natural and historic objects and simultaneously provide for the enjoyment of people to use that. National Park Service, one of the challenges that's very prominent in the acoustics area is at Grand Canyon National Park. So at Grand Canyon, you may have visitors who travel a long way to go to that park, and they want to hike on Bright Angel Trail and have a more or less wilderness experience where they are experiencing the park as it might have been in prehistoric times, and they're expecting it to be quiet and thoughtful and peaceful. And then there are other visitors to Grand Canyon who might have come a long distance to be there, and their choice is they want to fly in a helicopter tour or aircraft that's going over the park in an exciting view. But those two activities are in many ways incompatible, because if you were trying to have a very quiet experience and somebody zooms over in a helicopter, yeah. So who gets to choose? You know, who gets to decide what is the right use of that park? And so always the Park Service is trying to balance things. And as the people I work with tell me, no matter what they do, they're going to get sued. So everything that they do sort of has to be in the context of this legal realm, and that's very true. So for a while, I've been looking back at some of the regulatory context for the soundscape studies and things like that, and it goes back a long way. We were looking at the Organic Act in 1916. There's an important executive order Harry Truman issued in 1949 that had to do with the Boundary Waters canoe area that some of you may be familiar with in northern Minnesota. And it was actually an order to have no flights allowed in that area. And a lot of the reason was that people who were there canoeing didn't want to have these airplanes flying in. Now, there were some other parts of this that the outfitters didn't want to be in competition with people who could fly people in and so on. So there's another aspect, but a lot of the rationale was based on the acoustics part of that. 1960s, of course, the Wilderness Act and the emergence of the EPA during the Nixon administration, and the National Environmental Policy Act and the various changes there made people more aware of sound as an aspect of this. And then it was in the late 1980s, the National Parks Overflights Act came out. There had been a very tragic aircraft collision over Grand Canyon between two aircraft that, were, one was sightseeing and I think one was traveling through. But it raised a lot of concern about who's regulating this stuff, and is it the FAA that gets authority, or the National Park Service, or how does that all work? So Congress set up this act to investigate that, and then developed a set of air tour management rules, and there's been lots of money actually was made available to do some studies down there. So it's been an important source of publications and journal material that hadn't really been published before. More locally, the winter use plan in Yellowstone that was developed in the early part of this century had a lot of acoustical input as well. Primarily, the concern was about the noise from snowmobiles and snow coaches. And even to this day, there are continuing studies done on the road corridors that are acoustics. And you can look at the reports and the studies from that. Shan Burson and others are making those studies even now. And in 2006, the National Park Service Director's Order 47, which was started in 2000, got put into the regular management policies. And it identified soundscapes as a resource in the parks that have to be monitored and preserved. So up until then, it had been, the visual things and water cleanliness and so forth. But now soundscape is something that has to be included in impact studies and be monitored. Okay, so one of the projects that was an example coming out of this work, sponsored by the Park Service, that we did was to look at a cultural soundscape of a national historic site. Have any of you been to the Grant Coors Ranch, or you've seen the signs maybe up there by Deer Lodge? So this National Historic Site was established, I think, in the 1970s or 80s, relatively recently. And it's to commemorate the heritage of stock growers in Montana. So the commandment is to maintain it as a working ranch. The ranch that's there is not set up like Colonial Williamsburg or something where people are in costume and they're playing a role. It's you know, they wear Park Service garb and they drive tractors and everything like that. But because there's a historical aspect to it, they also do historical reenactments and have a variety of displays that visitors can enjoy. So the concern was there was a lot of changes going on in the Deer Lodge area, and the question was, what impact will this have on the visitor experience at Grand Coors Ranch? Visually, there probably wasn't much, but the sound and acoustics was a problem. So what we ended up doing at Grand Coors was a year-long continuous audio recording and monitoring system. So we've got an 8,600 hour continuous recording of what that park sounded like in 2009, day in and day out. And no one will ever listen to that recording because it would literally take 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for a year to listen to all of it. So what good is it if no one's going to listen to it? Well, computers are particularly good because they're very cooperative about doing tasks that go on and on and on, and you can get a cup of coffee while they're working and things like that. And so a lot of this will be done with our computerized analysis to very quickly search through this. Some of the sorts of things that have been of interest here is bird calls. The ranch owners kept very good diaries back in the 1800s up until the 1900s of when they saw, you know, different bird species come through, when the sandhill cranes came through and things like that. So with this audio recording, we can pick up the sound of those animals and detect when in the year that animal first appeared and, you know, when the last call of that goose or crane was. And so one of the things might be to do over time is to compare what is the migratory patterns of these different animals, and you can do that from the acoustics. So to make these recordings, we had a microphone that was mounted on a tripod, and you can kind of see that over here a little bit. It has a windscreen on it and then a spike to keep birds from landing on it, because the birds would land on it and poop on it, and it, you know, it's not good for the microphone. And we also had a anemometer. So this device here is measuring the wind speed. And you might say, well, what difference does the wind speed make? I'm sure you've heard the effects of wind on microphones, that turbulent sound. And if we're trying to search through this audio and determine the sound level, we want to make sure we know when that loud sound is caused by the wind turbulence and when it's an actual sound. And so by having that wind measurement, we've got it. And then we had a photovoltaic panel that was charging the battery to keep all this electronics running. When I first started doing audio, I'm old enough that it was back in the days when we stored audio on tape. Some of the youngsters may have seen that in the Smithsonian or something. So you had a tape, and the longest tapes that you could probably buy might hold an hour or 2 hours of sound. And so if you were going to try to use tape to make an 8,600 hour recording, that would be a lot of tape. And somebody would have to change the tape every hour or two. One of the great things from a standpoint of doing this sort of work now is that we can use Moore's Law to our advantage, and you can get flash memory for digital recorders now that is in the multiple gigabytes. And so now it's possible to make a recording that can be done continuously if you have power for a month. And then you pop that flash chip out and put a new one in, and then you can make another month of recording. So what I did during this year was I drove up there about once a month, popped the chip out, put a new one in, recalibrated everything, made sure the cows hadn't gotten into the area, and then left. And so the next thing that we're going to do from a research standpoint is develop ways to do this remotely, so you can utilize, you know, the cell phone system or other things to actually do data dumps without even having to drive out to those locations. So the National Park Service recording system, some of the technical information, was recording these kind of regulatory quality sound level readings, because again, if they made a decision to change a management policy at that park and somebody sued them, they would want to be able to have experts come out in court and explain how these measurements were done and that they were reliable. And then the audio that was recorded, we were actually using MP3, you know, the technique you use for music recordings, and relatively low bit rate, which at the time was necessary because of the memory available. And nowadays, a couple years later, 10 years later, you could certainly do a higher quality recording in the same amount of time. And then the wind speed measurements, as I mentioned. This is an example of a spectrogram for one particular day. This was May 4th, 2009. And each of the little tiles in here, this is at midnight to 1 a.m. This is 1 a.m. This is 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and so forth, and then all the way till midnight. And so this is displaying what was going on just visually throughout the day. And one of the interesting things to me in looking at this is that I can see starting at around 6 a.m., there's this little hatching going on, these little high frequency little tick lines that weren't there at 4 a.m. See that? There's that subtle little up and down. And that's the birds. So the dawn chorus of birds, the sun was probably coming up on that May 4th day, and then they all start chirping, and that becomes very prominent in the spectrogram. And then, 9 or 10 o'clock, it goes away. All the birds fly off and hunt their food and everything else. And then later in the evening, you look down here at around 7:30 or so, then they come back to roost, and we can see them again. The other big splashes of white in there are due to trains that were passing by through that area. That happened to be the year that the Superfund site, Milltown Dam, was being cleaned up, and so they had a couple trains of contaminated soil coming back from Missoula to be dumped back in the pits there at Anaconda. And so, again, a kind of a cultural interesting thing. We happen to have a year where all these trains went by, and it would be interesting to know this year, is that happening? Probably not. So there's a change that's occurred in our 1 year snapshot at that site compared to today. Okay, so I'm just about coming to the end here. So here's a couple of the current research areas that I'm involved in, and I'm looking for additional students to work on. One of them is this remote access idea. Many times what we would like to do is have these recordings going on near to roads, but we also would like to put some of these in the backcountry. And I enjoy going in the backcountry as much as anyone else, but it's in the winter and other times it may be difficult to get there. It is possible to design communication systems, radio communication systems, that would allow the information to be monitored in a remote fashion. We probably could not afford to use satellite communication with the amount of data that we're talking about, but if you could drive out within a mile or two of the site and then dump the recording wirelessly, that would be quite efficient. So a few months ago, we had the eclipse, solar eclipse that occurred, and one of the things that we worked on very hard was to get this communication from our students who sent high altitude balloons up to take video of the shadow of the eclipse going by. And so they had to figure out how to get a pretty high data rate from several miles away down to the ground. So we're going to use that kind of equipment. So it's sort of already been proved a little bit to do this kind of measurement. Probably the biggest additional research that's needed is this automated analysis of the data once we have it. And so there's been a variety of projects to do fast searching and identifying different kinds of sounds in those recordings. The other aspects here that is a common problem, I'm sure many of you have when you're collecting data, is how many of you have old files that are on floppy disks or zip disks or whatever, and keeping those things in a form that is accessible to other researchers is a real challenge, and I think it will continue to be a challenge. So getting that permanent archive going is going to be important. So we've got all this, gigabytes or about a terabyte of data from one microphone at one site for 1 year, and you start thinking, well, if we would like to do this more broadly, the scaling doesn't work very well. And so the idea of how this information will be obtained and used is another challenge that we have. Okay, and I'm going to jump ahead here. Just one of the things that you might be aware of is a couple years ago we did a seed grant project for the IOE, and I teamed up with Mark Lorang, who at that time was at the Flathead Lake Biological Station, and he was interested in studying acoustics in rivers. And in particular, he had done some studies of the Nyack River up by Glacier National Park. And he was interested in using hydrophones, which are microphones that operate underwater, to listen for the sound of sediment and cobbles and things like that being moved along by the water. And so he had done a little bit of this study, and let me see if I can play an example of that here. Can you even hear that? It sounds a little like static. Every now and then there's a little clunk. So each one of those is a little rock or pebble or something in the stream bed that's moving along and bumping into other ones. And so there's interest then in saying, can you use the acoustical analysis of that sound to determine something about river flow and the morphology of the stream bed? And another interest he had was in these aquatic insects and how they survive in this particular environment. And he had a theory that some of the insects are actually using the acoustics to know where the best flow in the river is and things like that. So it's an interesting hypothesis, and I'm hoping maybe there'll be an opportunity to do more work on that because it's kind of a cool idea.
Well, or could a male trout hear a female digging a rib?
Oh.
That would be loud, I would think.
Yeah.
Female trout digging.
Yeah. So these sorts of things we can think of, and for me then as an engineer, the challenge is, well, how can we measure that? How can we quantify that? What's the best way to get this done? And as far as the research questions go, I'm probably not the one who's going to immediately think of, well, what are the important questions for that ecosystem to understand? And so that's where, again, I think this collaboration is a lot of fun for everybody, because the different sides of this are contributing something that the others in the group couldn't do alone. And so I'm excited about that. And Montana State University has a tradition of doing a lot of these interdisciplinary projects, and I'd like to see more of them. We've had a few of our engineering students work on projects, senior design capstone projects, that are developing a technique or something that might be useful in ecology or plant science or some other area. So if you've got any of those things you think of where you'd think, well, it'd be really neat if we could measure this or monitor this or control this, please don't hesitate to call. It may not work out, but a 10-minute conversation over coffee wouldn't be so bad. And so if you find something that might make sense, those would be good to do.
Cobbles rolling in the river. Geologists don't like that. The size of the cobble, the number of them.
And my understanding of the Nyack is that it has a very interesting subsurface flow. So the rocks and a lot of the water is not actually free in the stream where we see it or float on it. A lot of it is actually moving in the ground. And so one of the studies that they did here in this map is all these little dots here are showing is that they have wells drilled all over the place, and they monitor the amount of water in those various wells in different seasons. And they can understand a little more about how much of the water is moving free and how much of it is in that subsurface area. And there was another theory about the acoustics in that, and we ended the project before we got into that too much, but it would be listening to the river from some distance away using that subsurface water. It was kind of an interesting area. So I should probably stop talking now, and if there are any questions or comments, I'd be happy to have them. I so much appreciate your attention. It's easy for me to talk about stuff I love doing, and I hope at least you've gotten a little glimpse or a earful of some of the aspects of that. So thank you very much.
Rob, I've got a question. Just it occurs to me that birds in particular have been used often as a surrogate for sort of an estimate of biodiversity in an area because they sample the environment for feed, for et cetera. And so you can capture a lot about birds.
Yeah.
Has anybody done that correlation between diversity of perhaps, just the bird diversity first, but actually maybe beyond that as well?
So the context I'm familiar with for that has to do with logging. So there have been studies of forests sort of before and after clear-cut logging. And I don't know how quantitative that work is, but certainly anecdotally, they can show which species return that are able to survive in a more open area, and which are counting on that heavy vegetation for their behavior. And I think post-fire might be another interesting aspect to that, to see if the types of birds that were present are there. And just as an example of another thing related is amphibian sounds. And one of the concerns in many areas of the country and around the world is that amphibians are having a tough time right now, frogs and so forth. And it's not completely understood, I don't think, exactly why that is, but one of the ways that the population of amphibians can be monitored is going out with an audio system and recording the intensity of the sound of those animals. So I thought that was a neat idea. So back in August, we had a research summer student who was working on things, and I said, yeah, you should take the system out and record the frogs out at the pond. And not being a naturalist, of course, it didn't occur to me that frogs aren't making chirping sounds in August. They'd use that for mating back in the spring. And so she was kind of frustrated not to be able to get those sounds and was really worried about the frogs. And I said, well, I think they're probably still there. It's just that they've learned that when mating season is over, you don't identify where you are, or else a raccoon will come and eat you or something. So, but anyway, yeah, it's an interesting thing.
To what extent can you imagine separating all these things out? So with respect to birds, you'd really like to know for many species what that whole time spectrum is. So you show what the whole sound spectrum is, but it would be nice to differentiate that into a series of things.
Yes. And that's an important, this ability to take that composite thing and separate it out into those different pieces is something our ears and brains do quite well. Mm-hmm. And my interest in this dates back to my PhD work, which was using audio music recordings and trying to separate out the different instrument sounds in a duet or something like that. And it's still an interesting problem and an ongoing problem. But yes, that's exactly the kind of thing that we need new research to do, is to try to be able to analytically focus in on the individual sound components. There's a specialty in electrical engineering called auditory scene analysis. And there's a acronym CASA, computational auditory scene analysis. And that's this combination of the psychology and the acoustics to try to get at these sorts of problems.
So is the library collection of sounds then useful to you? I mean, do they have a fingerprint of these different animals that you could then compare to your long recordings to figure out what they are? Or are they sort of two different worlds of information that you're not able to use?
It's certainly useful. Several years ago, I did a project to do bird call identification. And again, being a rather naive engineer, I thought, well, I just get these recordings of different species of birds and I do a learning algorithm on those, and then I'll be able to pull out those from this recording. Well, then the thing that's interesting is even within a species, these birds have different dialects. And in fact, I guess skilled people can tell if they listen to a particular species of bird, whether it's from the southeastern United States or the western, based on its subtle changes in its sound. And so it became more dimensions of control than just getting that original recording. But yeah, certainly that sort of thing I think would be a very good place to start, because you've got a lot of material there, and if you're using a learning algorithm, you can benefit from that. The recordings, many of them in the Acoustic Atlas, are done very well, and they've got good information, good metadata about where they were recorded, what the equipment used was, a lot of the circumstances. So although I don't know that many of them are actually calibrated as far as the decibel level the way I would do, I think it's still pretty useful to have that kind of repository. And most of the people I know that are using it for film sound effects and other things like that, which is, it's a valid use too.
So you mentioned the slurping sound of worms, and that catches my attention. I think that's going to be a problem, that there may be gravel running through. There certainly is, and it's got to have its own sound. A wonderful thing to study those individuals in anticipation of pulling that all out of the whole soundscape.
Yeah. Well, one
More
of
interesting than birds by far. More interesting by far.
well, it's you know, that my trajectory on this, I first came to Montana and I had been working primarily in entertainment audio and product development and things like that. And when I got to Montana, I said, well, what can I do here that would be unique to this place? And that's where I got into the soundscape studies, because at the time in the early 2000s, all there was interest was going on in Yellowstone. And the other thing that that's led to is now I do most of my funded research in audio forensic analysis. And so there are increasing numbers of law enforcement officers walking around with vest cameras and cars with cameras. And, you know, anytime there's one of these tragedies like that disaster down in Las Vegas and so on, there's lots of material available. And so many court cases now involve interpreting what's happening based on the acoustics of that. And so one of the challenges is relevant to this is that often we're trying to detect very, very quiet sounds in the presence of extremely loud sounds. And so the dynamic range of these systems and the ability to separate not just in frequency, but also in amplitude is a challenge. And fortunately, the technology is getting quite a bit better for that than it used to be. But it's still an interesting area.
So you were comparing light and sound, and you talked about lenses. So if I wanted to study sound, I think I would amplify it and look at things. But this is probably a stupid question. Are there sound lenses where sounds are bent on purpose for some reason?
The types of equivalent lenses that you'd have would be more like telescope reflector lenses. So you may have seen
Parabolic.
with a collector more than a focusing lens aspect. The big problem with lenses is with optics, the entire range of visible light is barely a factor of 2 in wavelength. And it's already tough enough to get optics designed that don't have aberrations and, you know, that don't cause a rainbow to appear in the picture. So there's a real critical design there. Audio, our ears are able to hear from about 20 hertz, where the wavelength is 30 meters long, to 20 kilohertz, where the wavelength is less than an inch. And so if you were trying to design a system that had 3 decades of wavelength capability, it's just not feasible. So unfortunately, unless we were listening to just one specific frequency where we could design for that, the range of wavelengths is so big that it's just not, unfortunately, not possible that way.
So are you recording within the range of human hearing? Because there are a lot of animals that communicate outside our range.
Most of this work that I've done has been in the human audible range, but there are people who do a lot of studies of bats, and the bats use ultrasonic frequencies that are up in the humans. I can hear maybe as high as 10 kilohertz now, but
who's the professor at U of M who does transmission of alarm calls through soundscapes?
Oh.
What?
Giddy?
I can't remember.
It starts with a G.
Yeah, we heard him at Audubon Society.
Yeah.
But yeah, you would like him.
Yeah, well, this
same
whole
guy.
interspecies thing is another fascinating.
Yeah, right. So he records from many locations in forest tract simultaneously, and then he can look at the transmission of an alarm call from one animal to another. But he's got to go outside of human hearing because some of those are high pitch, like the part of a chickadee that we hear is only part of the chickadee.
The challenge there is most of the professional audio equipment that's available is specified and designed to operate on audio frequencies. And so it's sort of a custom or special thing to get the ultrasonic detectors, but they are available, and it's clearly, important for that type of work.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to cut us off here.
Yep.
Beyond time. But
Thank you so much.
thank you very much, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thanks, Sarah.
All right.